Amora, a blind orphan, lived alone in the small village of Pocha. She was known by many as the blind prostitute. Her blindness was not from birth, it came after a tragic incident in her childhood. After the death of Amora's parents, her Aunt Sylvia took her in. Auntie Sylvia was a cruel teacher who would beat Amora at the slightest provocation. Ironically, Sylvia was loved by both the rich and the poor, the old and the young in the village. One fateful day, Amora was sent to fetch firewood. On her return, Sylvia's youngest child accidentally burned her hand in the fire. Furious, Auntie Sylvia blamed Amora for the accident. In a fit of rage, she dragged Amora to the burning firewood in the kitchen and splashed the flames at her. Tragically, the fire hit Amora's eyes, and she instantly lost her eyesight. Realizing the gravity of what she had done, Auntie Sylvia took Amora on an early morning bus to their abandoned family house in a distant hometown and then disappeared. She left Amora with no food or money, abandoning her to fend for herself. Alone and blind, Amora wandered the village with no one to care for her. Despite her blindness, Amora managed to connect with people. She made various friends, some of whom took care of her. Her tragic story became well known in the market. Among her friends, both good and bad, was a girl named Shishi. Shishi had no family and lived with her uncle, where she was mistreated by her uncle's wife. Seeing an opportunity for a better life, Shishi decided to stay with Amora. Together, Amora and Shishi resorted to dubious means to survive. They faced many challenges but continued to struggle and support each other in their quest for a better life. They used Amora's condition to rob people. One day, Nemesis caught up with them. One evening, as usual, Amora and Shishi went to a nearby farm to steal maize to sell in the market. Unknown to them, the owner saw them from a distance. Late at night, the farm owner, along with some boys, went to Amora's compound. Shishi, wandering outside, saw them and quickly ran back to Amora's compound. "Amora, we need to leave." "Now," Shishi said in a firm and scared tone. "Leave? Why?" "There's no time to explain. They're coming for us." Amora immediately stood up with Shishi's help. They ran away through the back door, hearing the shouts of the farmer and his boys. When they reached the edge of the market, the shouts grew louder and closer. They ran until they heard no voices or sounds. With nowhere to stay, they slept in the woods. The following morning, they had to keep walking to an unknown destination, filled with pain and regret. But what could they have done? They needed to survive in this lonely world, and the only means they had was stealing. Hungry and tired, they kept walking, thinking of the next way to survive. Days turned into weeks as Amora and Shishi wandered through the forest until they finally ended up in a small village. By this time, they had become like ghosts among the living. With their dirty and smelly bodies, they begged for food, relying on the kindness of strangers, which was often rare. They finally found an abandoned hut to stay in. Shishi made sure to go out and get food for them both. Sometimes, Amora and Shishi would go out together to find food. When Shishi was absent, Amora's blindness made her an easy target. Coins and food were stolen from her as quickly as they were given. One evening, as Amora sat quietly by the roadside begging for alms, with suicidal thoughts in her mind, she heard a calm voice. "Are you lost, dear?" Mrs. Ease asked. "I have nowhere to go," Amora replied, clutching her cane. "Who are you?" "My name is Mrs. Ease. I run a house nearby. A place for women like you." Her voice was honeyed, but there was a steel underneath that Amora didn't miss. "What kind of place?" Amora asked, though a part of her already knew. "A place where you can make a living. No more begging. No more stealing." Mrs. E's hand rested lightly on Amora's shoulder, the touch both comforting and possessive. Amora thought for a moment and finally decided to go with her. While she was about to tell Mrs. Ease about Shishi, Shishi showed up. She was surprised to see a good-looking woman standing next to Amora. Amora explained what Mrs. Ease had told her. Even though Shishi was not entirely in support of the idea, they still followed Mrs. Ease. As they arrived at Mrs. E's abode, the air was thick with the scent of cheap perfume and desperation. The other women in the house eyed Amora and Shishi with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Mrs. Ease led them to a small room, bare except for a mattress and a single candle. She told them to clean up and come downstairs once they were done, as work started that night. As soon as Mrs. Ease left, Shishi expressed her discomfort with the situation, telling Amora that if she still felt uneasy by the next day, they should leave. Amora, however, had already determined to stay, even if Shishi chose to leave. Her desperation to survive had driven her to this point, and there was no turning back. Both Amora and Shishi were virgins, but Amora felt that their virginity offered them nothing in their dire situation. Shishi couldn't bring herself to do such work and begged Amora that night to leave before it was too late. Amora refused. With no other choice, Shishi left, her eyes filled with tears and pain. She slipped quietly out of Mrs. E's compound, knowing that Mrs. Ease might kill her if she knew she was running away. That night, Amora's first client was a businessman with rough hands and a rougher temper. He cared nothing for her blindness, seeing it as nothing more than a trivial detail. The pain and humiliation were unbearable, each moment was a torment for her. When he was done, he tossed a few coins onto the bed and left. As the door closed behind him, Amora lay still, her body shaking with silent sobs. This was her new reality, a life of exploitation and abuse, her dreams shattered beyond repair. She had become a prisoner of circumstance, her body a commodity to be traded and discarded. In the weeks that followed, Amora learned to numb herself to the pain. She became adept at feigning interest, her blindness adding a tragic allure that drew men to her like moths to a flame. Mrs. Ease was pleased with her, as the client's fascination with the blind prostitute brought in a steady stream of money. But inside, Amora's heart hardened with each passing day. She began to understand the depths of human cruelty, how people could take advantage of the weak and vulnerable without a second thought. The kindness she had once known was a distant memory, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. Amora's descent into prostitution was not just a fall from grace but a deliberate choice, a means of survival in a world that had shown her no mercy. Her blindness had become a weapon wielded by those who sought to control her. Often, she would think of her friend Shishi, wondering how she was surviving. Should she have followed her? Amora often wondered. It was easier for Shishi to find help, but for her, it was different due to her blindness. She felt she would be a burden to Shishi. Yes, I made the right decision, she reassured herself. As the months turned into years, Amora's name became known throughout the village, her story a tragic legend whispered among the inhabitants. But behind the legend was a woman still fighting to reclaim her dignity, to find a way out of the darkness that had consumed her life. And so, the blind prostitute continued her journey, each step a painful reminder of what she had lost and a desperate plea for what she hoped to regain. Amora's routine continued unabated. Each night, she welcomed strangers into her dimly lit room. It was a life devoid of hope, until the night a man named Kelechi walked into her world. Kelechi was different from the others. He was gentle, with a soft and manly voice. He didn't come for the usual reasons, his visits were frequent, but he never took advantage of her. Instead, he spoke to her, asked about her past, and listened intently to her story. He was a calm man, and for the first time in years, Amora felt a glimmer of hope. One night, as they sat in her small room, Kelechi finally spoke of his intentions. Amora, I want to help you. I want to take you away from this place. Amora's heart raced. The thought of leaving Mrs. E's house was a dream she had long abandoned. Why would you want to help someone like me? Kelechi took her hands in his touch gentle yet firm. Because you deserve better. You deserve a chance at a real life, away from all this pain. Tears filled Amora's sightless eyes as she clung to his hands. But how? Mrs. Ease would never let me go. We'll find a way, he promised. I have some money saved up. We'll leave this village and start fresh somewhere new. For the first time in years, Amora allowed herself to dream. But the reality of her situation soon intruded. Mrs. Ease had eyes and ears everywhere, and it wasn't long before she learned of Kelechi's visits. One evening, as Amora prepared for the night's work, Mrs. Ease stormed into her room, her face filled with anger. I hear you've been making plans, Amora, she said, plans to leave me. Amora's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Madam, Silence. Mrs. Ease landed a hot slap on Amora's face. You think you can just walk away from this life? From me? You belong to me, Amora. You think you can run off with some man and live happily ever after? Amora's voice trembled as she replied, Kelechi wants to help me. He? Kelechi? Mrs. Ease sneered. His family would never accept you. You're nothing but a blind prostitute. You think they'll let him marry someone like you? The truth of Mrs. E's words cut deep, but Amora refused to give up hope. I don't care about his family. I just want a chance to live. Mrs. E's laugh was cold and cruel. You'll never leave here, Amora. If you try, I'll make sure you regret it. Do you understand? Amora nodded, her spirit crushed but not entirely broken. She knew Mrs. E's threats were not empty, and the fear of what she might do kept her in line. At that moment, she understood why her friend Shishi had told her to leave before it was too late. Despite the threats, Kelechi continued to visit. His presence was a beacon of hope to her, but the reality of their situation was grim. His family had indeed learned of Amora, and their reaction was predictably harsh. They forbade Kelechi from seeing her, threatening to disown him if he continued his pursuit. Kelechi was torn between his love for Amora and his loyalty to his family. Each visit became a painful reminder of the life they could never have. But he refused to abandon her, even as the weight of his family's disapproval bore down on him. One night, as they sat together in the dim light of her room, Kelechi made a decision. Amora, I can't stand by and watch you suffer. We'll leave tonight. I have enough money to get us far away from here. Amora's heart soared at the thought, but the fear of Mrs. E's retribution loomed large. She'll come after us, Kelechi. She won't let me go that easily. Let her come, he said fiercely. I'll protect you. We'll go somewhere she can't find us. Amora nodded with hope. That night, under the cover of darkness, they fled Mrs. E's house. They moved quickly through the streets, avoiding the prying eyes and ears that might alert Mrs. E's of their escape. But freedom was not easily won. As they reached the outskirts of the village, they heard the distant shouts of pursuit. Mrs. E's enforcers were not far behind, and the realization made Amora scared. Kelechi held her close, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. We'll keep running, Amora. We won't let them take us back. With their hearts pounding and the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer, Amora and Kelechi disappeared into the night. The journey ahead was filled with danger, and the shadows of their past would not be easily escaped. As they ventured into the unknown, their freedom seemed like a fragile hope and a daunting challenge, a test of their love and their will to survive. Amora and Kelechi ran through the rain-soaked village, their hearts pounding with both fear and hope. The shouts of their pursuers faded into the distance, but the tension between them remained. They had escaped Mrs. E's sight, but the shadow of her influence loomed large, and the weight of their uncertain future pressed heavily on them. They found an abandoned house to stay. For a brief moment, it seemed as if they might be able to carve out a new life together. Kelechi worked tirelessly, taking odd jobs to support them, while Amora stayed hidden, her blindness making her even more vulnerable in the unfamiliar surroundings. But the peace was fragile. Kelechi's family continued to exert pressure on him, and the constant fear of discovery by Mrs. E's boys made her miserable. The strain took its toll on both of them. Kelechi grew increasingly weary and distant, burdened by the sacrifices he had made and the relentless disapproval of his family. One night, as the rain battered against the windows, Amora sat alone in their small room, her thoughts a turbulent mix of despair and longing. The dreams of a new life had been crushed by the harsh reality of their situation. She could feel Kelechi slipping away, his love strained by the unrelenting challenges they faced. She felt alone, abandoned by fate and forsaken by the world. Kelechi's footsteps approached, and she quickly wiped the tears from her face. Amora, we need to talk, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I've been offered a job in another village. It's a chance for us to start over, but it means leaving everything behind. Even you. Kelechi lied to her in order to return to his normal life, as there was no hope or means of survival for them. The words cut through Amora like a knife. She had known this moment might come, but the reality was more painful than she had imagined. You're leaving me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kelechi knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. I don't want to, Amora, But I can't keep living like this. I've done everything I can to protect you, but I'm losing myself in the process. Maybe it's time for you to find your own way." The finality of his words shattered the last remnants of Amora's hope. She nodded, unable to speak, her heart breaking into pieces. Kelechi left the next morning, leaving Amora alone in the tiny room that now felt like a prison. Days turned into weeks, and Amora's despair deepened. She felt abandoned and hopeless, trapped in a life she could no longer bear. The constant fear of discovery by Mrs. E's men haunted her every moment. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Amora made her way to the roof of the boarding house. The village stretched out below her, a maze of lights and shadows. She stood at the edge, the wind tugging at her hair, and for a moment, she felt a strange sense of peace. "I'm sorry, Shishi. I tried," she whispered into the wind. "I really tried." With a final, deep breath, Amora stepped off the edge. The world seemed to slow as she fell, the rush of air a fleeting moment of freedom before the darkness claimed her. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact silencing her pain and sorrow forever. The next morning, the village awoke to the news of the blind prostitute's tragic end. Whispers spread through the streets, mingling with the morning breeze. Some mourned her, others dismissed her death as the inevitable conclusion of a doomed life. Mrs. E's heard the news with cold indifference, her heart long hardened to the suffering of those she exploited. But amidst this, a man knelt beside Amora's lifeless body, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. Kelechi had returned, too late to save her but not too late to honor her memory. He gently placed his necklace around her neck, saying, "She finally gained the freedom she wanted." As he walked away, Kelechi vowed never to forget the woman who had fought so bravely against the darkness that had engulfed her life. As the villagers gathered around Amora's grave, a sense of solemnity and reflection hung in the air. The tragic story of the blind prostitute, as she was known, became a powerful cautionary tale, echoing through the generations. Her life and death highlighted the harsh realities faced by those who are vulnerable and the dire consequences of neglect and exploitation. Elders in the village began to share Amora's story with the younger generation, emphasizing the importance of compassion, community support, and standing up against injustice. They spoke of Amora's bravery and resilience, urging the youth to learn from her struggles and to ensure that no one else in their community would have to endure such hardships. Amora's grave became a place of reflection and remembrance. Villagers would often visit, leaving flowers and offering prayers, promising to keep her memory alive. Her story was not just a tale of sorrow, but a beacon of hope and change, reminding the community of their collective responsibility to ensure that no one is left behind. Through the lessons learned from Amora's life and death, the village of Pocha began to transform. It became a place where kindness, justice, and community support were at the forefront, ensuring a brighter future for all its inhabitants.